Hello, this discussion we'll be talking about the inverse function of trig functions, and this will be rather short, so it won't take us too long for this one. So let's begin. We're just going to begin with this example. Finding the inverse function of a trig function. Find the inverse of f of x, 3 times the cosine of x plus 1. Now remember, x is between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. That's important because you cannot apply a cosine inverse unless that's true. And then find the range of f and the domain and the range of the inverse function. So we begin with this one, y equals the cosine of x plus 1. So remember, you switch the x and the y. That's how you do an inverse in general. You switch the coordinates and then you solve for y. So we'll move the 1 to the other side. So it'll be x minus 1 equals 3 cosine of y. Then what do? You divide by 3. Then cosine of y equals x minus 1 equals 0, x minus 1 over 3. Now, we want to solve for y. How do you get rid of the cosine when you want to isolate the y? You apply the definition of an inverse function. Why can you do that? Because they tell you that you're between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. So because x is between negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, then you can do this next step. Y equals the cosine inverse of x minus 1 over 3. And that is the inverse function. Okay? So that is the inverse function of the cosine of 3 times cosine of x plus 1. So recall that the domain of the function and the range of the inverse and the range of the function is the domain of the inverse. So what is the domain of the inverse? Well, you got to remember now that you can only take the cosine inverse of numbers that are between negative 1 to a positive 1. That's the only thing you're allowed to do. So you'll need to solve the equation x minus 1 divided by 3, and you got to include that between negative 1 to a positive 1. When you do that, x minus 1 has to be between negative 3 to positive 3. Why? Multiply by 3 throughout. And then adding 1 tells me x has to be between negative 2 to 4. Now you're like, what does that mean? It means that you are allowed to put numbers between negative 2 to 4 in that cosine inverse function that you just found. Otherwise, it won't be between 1 and negative 1. So for example, if you pick 3, it'd be okay. Because 3 minus 1 is 2, and then 2 divided by 3 is 2/3. And since 2/3 is between negative 1 to a positive 1, you can apply the cosine inverse. But let's say you pick 5, x equals 5, because that's not between negative 2 and 4. So if you pick 5, 5 minus 1 is 4, and 4 divided by 3 is 4/3. And that is not between negative 1 to a positive 1. So the domain of this inverse function is between negative 2 to 4, which, by the way, is the range of the original function. So the range of the original function is between negative 2 and 4. And the range of the inverse function is negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. How do you know that? Because it was given to me that x has to be between negative pi over 2 to a positive pi over 2 in the original function. So that makes the range of the inverse to do that. So x had to be between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2 just to get this ball rolling. Because if it wasn't between negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2, then we would never been allowed to take the inverse cosine to begin with. So, but anyway, making that between negative pi over 2 to pi over 2 gave us the range of the inverse automatically. Alrighty? So that concludes this discussion. If you have any questions on it, let me know. And you have a good day.